The cabin lights gleamed off polished leather seats as Margaret Hayes clutched her worn travel bag, her other hand resting gently on the swell of her belly. 7 months pregnant and exhausted from 3 connecting flights, she'd finally made it aboard this private charter, her last hope of reaching her dying mother in Boston before it was too late. The plane's owner, a man in an expensive suit, glanced up from his phone with cold eyes. "I'm sorry, but you can't fly like that," he said, his voice dripping with disdain as he gestured toward her condition. "It's a liability. You'll have to get off." Margaret's heart sank. She tried to explain. Her mother, the emergency, the doctor's clearance, but he'd already turned away, signaling the crew. As 2 attendants approached to escort her out, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know that this man's cruelty would soon cost him everything he'd built. "Where are you watching from tonight?" 3 hours earlier, Margaret had been standing in LaGuardia Airport, phone pressed to her ear, listening to her sister's trembling voice. "Mom's asking for you, Maggie. The doctors say maybe a day, 2 at most." The words had knocked the air from Margaret's lungs. She'd known her mother's heart was failing, but she'd thought there'd be more time. There's always supposed to be more time. Margaret was a hospice nurse in Atlanta, someone who'd spent 20 years helping families navigate their final goodbyes. She understood death intimately, professionally, but nothing prepared you for losing your own mother. She'd booked the first available flight, but storms across the Midwest had created a cascade of cancellations. By evening, she'd been stranded in New York with no commercial options until morning. Too late. Far too late. That's when she'd overheard 2 businessmen talking near the gate about a private charter leaving for Boston in an hour. One had canceled, and they had an empty seat. Margaret had never asked for help easily. A lifetime of taking care of others had taught her to carry her own burdens. But desperation makes us humble. She'd approached them with shaking hands, explaining her situation. The older of the 2 men, gray-haired with kind eyes, had looked at her pregnant belly and nodded immediately. "Of course. Come with us." No charge. His companion had been less enthusiastic but hadn't objected. They'd driven her to a small private terminal in New Jersey, where a sleek jet waited on the tarmac. That's where she'd met Jonathan Hartwell. Jonathan was exactly the kind of man Margaret had spent her life avoiding, wealthy, entitled, and utterly convinced that money made him important. At 47, he'd made his fortune in real estate development, buying up struggling properties and flipping them for profit. He wore his success like armor, the $10,000 watch, the handmade Italian shoes, the way he spoke to service workers as if they were furniture. The moment Margaret stepped into the cabin, she felt his disapproval. His eyes had traveled from her clearance rack coat to her scuffed shoes to her obviously pregnant state, and his expression had soured. "Who's this?" He'd asked the gray-haired man, Frank, a business associate, as if Margaret wasn't standing right there. Frank had explained the situation warmly. "Margaret's mother is dying. I offered her our extra seat." Jonathan's jaw had tightened. "Frank, can I speak with you privately?" They'd stepped toward the cockpit, but their voices carried. "You can't just invite random people onto my plane. What if something happens? What if she goes into labor mid-flight? Do you know the liability? John, have a heart. She's a nurse. She's been cleared to fly. Her mother's dying. That's very sad, but it's not my problem. I can't risk it." Margaret had felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a burden, an inconvenience. She'd stood there, one hand on her belly, feeling her daughter kick as if sensing her mother's distress. She'd wanted to turn and leave with whatever dignity she could salvage. But then she'd thought of her mother's face, the way her mom used to braid her hair before school, the smell of her Sunday pot roast, the sound of her laugh. When Jonathan had returned and delivered his verdict, Margaret had tried reason. "I have a letter from my doctor. I'm healthy. Please, I'll sign anything. My mother raised 4 kids by herself after my dad died. She worked double shifts as a cleaning woman so we could go to college. She's the best person I've ever known, and she's dying alone right now because I can't get to her." Her voice had broken on those last words, tears spilling down her cheeks. She wasn't above begging. Pride means nothing when you're racing death. But Jonathan's face had remained impassive, unmoved by her pain. "I'm sorry for your situation, but my decision is final. Please exit the aircraft." He'd glanced at his watch as if she were making him late for something important. Frank had protested, "For God's sake, John!" But Jonathan had cut him off with a sharp look. As the crew had approached to escort her out, Margaret had felt something crack inside her, not just her heart, but her faith in human kindness. She worked in hospice because she believed people were fundamentally good, that compassion was universal. But standing there, watching this wealthy man check his phone while denying her dying mother a final goodbye, she'd wondered if she'd been naive all along. She'd walked down those plain stairs into the cold November night, each step feeling like betrayal, betraying her mother, betraying herself. Behind her, she heard the door seal shut and engines begin to whine. The jet would be in Boston in 90 minutes. She wouldn't arrive until tomorrow afternoon if she was lucky. By then, her mother would likely be gone. Margaret stood in the parking lot of the private terminal, watching Jonathan's plane taxi down the runway. The November wind cut through her thin jacket, but she barely felt it. Numbness had replaced the initial shock and pain. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and called her sister. "I couldn't get on the plane." "Sarah, I'll be there as soon as I can tomorrow. I promise." Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. On the other end, she heard her sister's sharp intake of breath, then soft crying. "I'll tell Mom you're coming. I'll tell her to wait." But they both knew you couldn't negotiate with death. It came on its own schedule, indifferent to our plans and promises. Margaret was about to call a rideshare when a hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Frank, the gray-haired businessman, slightly out of breath. "I got off the plane," he said simply. What John did was unconscionable. "Here!" He pressed his car keys into her hand. "My Tesla's parked right there, the blue one. It's fully charged. Drive it to Boston. I'll get it back some other time." Margaret stared at the keys, then at this stranger's kind face, and something broke loose in her chest. "I can't accept—" "Yes, you can. I'm 71 years old, and I've made more money than I'll ever spend. But I was there when my mother died, held her hand, told her I loved her. That memory is worth more than anything in my portfolio. You deserve that moment, too." His eyes were gentle behind his glasses. "Go, drive fast but safe. You've got 4, maybe 5 hours ahead of you." This time, when Margaret cried, they were tears of gratitude mixed with grief. She hugged Frank quickly, breathing in his grandfather's smell of mint and old-fashioned cologne, then hurried to the car. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Frank waving, a solitary figure backlit by the terminal lights. The drive became a blur of highway lights and racing thoughts. Margaret gripped the steering wheel, her daughter pressing insistently against her ribs. "Not yet, baby girl," she whispered. "Just a little longer. Let me say goodbye first." She'd been talking to her unborn daughter for months now, telling her about the grandmother she'd never meet, the woman who'd taught Margaret that love was measured not in words, but in sacrifice. As miles disappeared beneath her tires, Margaret's mind wandered to her own childhood. Her mother, Rosa, had immigrated from Colombia at 19, pregnant and alone after Margaret's father died in a construction accident. Rosa had cleaned office buildings at night, houses during the day, her hands always raw from chemicals and hard work. But she'd never complained. "We do what we must for those we love," she'd say in her accented English. "That is what makes us human." Margaret had become a nurse because of her mother, watching Rosa care for an elderly neighbor with dementia, seeing her spend her rare days off volunteering at their church's medical clinic. Helping people when they're most vulnerable, Rosa had told her. That's sacred work, Mija. That's when you see someone's true soul. Now Margaret wondered what Jonathan Hartwell's true soul looked like. Had anyone ever taught him about kindness? About seeing other people as more than obstacles or liabilities? Meanwhile, 30,000 feet above her, Jonathan was having his own thoughts, though not about Margaret. He'd already dismissed the incident, mentally categorizing it under unpleasant but necessary. He was reviewing contracts on his tablet, calculating profit margins when Frank's empty seat caught his eye. "Where's Frank?" he asked his assistant. "He got off the plane, sir." He said he couldn't be part of this. Something flickered across Jonathan's face, irritation, maybe a whisper of shame, but he pushed it away. Frank was being dramatic, It was business. You couldn't let emotion cloud judgment. His phone buzzed with an email from his PR team. They were preparing for tomorrow's big announcement, Jonathan Hartwell's new philanthropic initiative. He was donating $10 million to build a children's hospital wing, complete with a press conference and photo opportunities. His publicist had crafted a beautiful speech about giving back, about caring for the vulnerable, about his mother's values inspiring his generosity. The irony was completely lost on him. Back on the highway, Margaret's phone rang through the car speakers. Sarah's number. Margaret's heart stopped. "No," she breathed. "No, please!" But Sarah's voice was urgent, not grief-stricken. "Maggie, where are you?" "About 3 hours out. I'm driving. A man lent me his car. Mom's awake. She's asking for you. She says she won't let go until she sees you. The nurse said it's impossible. People don't will themselves to stay alive. But Mom's doing it. She's fighting, Maggie. She's waiting for you." Margaret's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, her vision blurring with tears. Her mother, even at the end, was still giving her the greatest gift. Time. "Tell her I'm coming. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry. Just drive safe." She knows. She's always known. If this moment touched your heart, please give this story a thumbs up. The hours crawled and flew simultaneously. Margaret drove through the darkness, making deals with God, with the universe, with death itself. Her back ached. Her daughter kicked restlessly, but she didn't stop. Behind her, somewhere in that same darkness, Jonathan's plane had long since landed. He was probably at a nice restaurant by now, ordering expensive wine, completely unaware that his moment of cruelty had set something in motion that would change his life forever. Because Margaret Hayes wasn't just a pregnant nurse. She was about to become something else entirely, something that would make Jonathan Hartwell's philanthropy announcement tomorrow look like the hollow gesture it was. Margaret pulled into Boston General's parking garage at 2:17 in the morning. Her hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel, and her lower back screamed in protest as she heaved herself out of the car. She half ran, half waddled through the automatic doors, following the familiar maze of hospital corridors to the cardiac unit on the 4th floor. Sarah met her outside their mother's room, looking exhausted and relieved. The sisters embraced without words, holding onto each other the way they had as children during thunderstorms. "She's sleeping now," Sarah whispered. "But she made it. She waited for you." Margaret eased open the door. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of monitors. Rosa Hayes lay small and fragile against the white sheets, her once strong hands now translucent and spotted with age. An oxygen tube ran beneath her nose, and her breathing was shallow, labored. She looked so different from the vibrant woman who'd danced in their kitchen while cooking, who'd worked 2 jobs without complaint, who'd taught her daughters that strength came in quiet forms. Margaret approached the bed slowly, carefully lowering herself into the chair beside it. She took her mother's hand, that hand that had braided her hair, bandaged her scraped knees, worked so hard to give her daughters better lives. "Mama," she whispered in Spanish. "Estoy aquí." "I'm here." Rosa's eyes fluttered open, cloudy but aware. A small smile touched her lips. "Mi hija," she breathed. "You came. Of course I came. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." Margaret didn't mention the plane, the man who'd tried to prevent this moment. What did it matter now? She was here. That's all that counted. They talked through the night, or rather, Margaret talked while Rosa listened, occasionally squeezing her daughter's hand. Margaret told her about the baby, about Frank's unexpected kindness, about the drive through the darkness. She told her mother all the things she'd been saving up, all the gratitude and love she'd never quite found the right words for. "You gave us everything," Margaret said, tears streaming freely. "You worked yourself to exhaustion so we could have opportunities you never got. You taught us what real strength looks like, not the kind that demands respect, but the kind that earns it through sacrifice and love." Rosa's voice was barely audible. "I had everything I needed, you and your sisters. That was my wealth, that was my success." Her eyes moved to Margaret's belly. "And now you'll understand. When she's born, you'll know. There's no greater purpose than loving someone more than yourself. Have you ever had a moment like this with a parent? When all the roles reverse and you realize they're the ones who need care now? Let us know in the comments. as dawn broke through the hospital window, painting the room in shades of rose and gold. Rosa's breathing changed. Margaret knew the sound. She'd heard it countless times in her work. But knowing didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it worse. She knew exactly what was coming, could read death's approach like a familiar text. Sarah joined them, and together the sisters sat with their mother as her breathing slowed, deepened, then finally grew quiet. Rosa Hayes died at 6:32 in the morning, holding both her daughter's hands, her face peaceful. Margaret had helped countless families through this moment, had guided them through grief with professional compassion. But now, sitting in that chair, she was just a daughter who'd lost her mother. The pain was enormous, breathtaking, but underneath it lay something else, gratitude. She'd made it. She'd been here. Her mother hadn't died alone. She thought about Jonathan Hartwell then, wondering if he'd ever sat with someone he loved as they died, if he understood what he'd almost stolen from her. Anger flickered briefly, but she was too exhausted for rage. Besides, her mother wouldn't have wanted that. Rosa had always said bitterness was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The nurses gave the sisters time alone with their mother's body. They cried, they told stories, they held her cooling hands. Around 8 o'clock, an older nurse knocked gently. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "But I wanted to let you know. There's a reporter in the lobby asking about Mrs. Hayes. Something about tomorrow's hospital dedication. I can send them away if you'd like." Margaret and Sarah exchanged confused looks. "What hospital dedication?" Sarah asked. The nurse consulted her tablet. "The new children's wing. Apparently Mrs. Hayes' name came up in connection with the donor. A Mr. Hartwell is holding a press conference at 10 to announce his gift, and someone on his PR team wanted a statement from the Hayes family." The name hit Margaret like cold water. Hartwell. Jonathan Hartwell. The man who'd kicked her off his plane was connected to her mother somehow? That made no sense. Rosa had cleaned houses her whole life. What could she possibly have to do with a real estate millionaire? But as the pieces began sliding into place, Margaret felt her blood run cold. She stood abruptly, her face pale. "Sarah, did Mom still have that box? The one with old Dad's old papers?" "In her apartment, I think. Why?" "Because," Margaret said slowly, her voice shaking, "I think I know exactly who Jonathan Hartwell is." 2 hours later, Margaret stood in her mother's modest apartment, surrounded by the accumulation of a life lived simply. The walls were covered with family photos, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. On the kitchen counter sat the container of her mother's famous ajiaco soup, made just last week before she'd collapsed. The apartment smelled like her mother, lavender soap and Café Bustelo, comfort and memory. Sarah pulled down a battered shoebox from the closet shelf, the one they'd both seen countless times but never really examined. Inside were their father's documents, his birth certificate, their parents' marriage license, old pay stubs. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a photograph. Margaret lifted it with trembling hands. The black and white image showed 2 young men in construction gear, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was obviously her father. She recognized his smile, the one she'd inherited. The other young man had dark hair and bright eyes, looking carefree and happy in a way that seemed utterly foreign to the Jonathan Hartwell she'd met. On the back, in her mother's careful handwriting, Michael and Jonathan, 1976, brothers in everything but blood. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, reading over Margaret's shoulder. "Mom's Jonathan is the same person?" Margaret found more in the box, letters, postcards, old newspaper clippings. She read quickly, piecing together a story her mother had rarely discussed. Her father, Michael, and Jonathan Hartwell had been best friends since childhood, both from poor families in South Boston. They'd worked construction together, dreamed together. When Michael had gotten Rosa pregnant, Jonathan had been his best man at their quick courthouse wedding. The letters showed a genuine friendship, Jonathan asking about the baby, sending small gifts they couldn't afford themselves. Then came the accident. Michael had fallen from scaffolding on a high-rise project, dying instantly. He was 23 years old. Margaret had been 3 months away from being born. After that, the letters changed. Jonathan wrote promising to help Rosa, to make sure she was okay. But then came a different kind of letter, from a lawyer. Jonathan's uncle had died, leaving him a considerable inheritance. He was going to college, moving up, investing in real estate. The letters grew shorter, less frequent. He was busy. He was sorry. He couldn't make the funeral. The final letter, dated 1978, was brief. Dear Rosa, I'm starting my business, and things are complicated. I've enclosed what I can to help with the baby. I hope you understand. I have to focus on my future now. Best wishes, Jonathan. Inside the envelope was a check for $500, a sum that had probably felt generous to a young man just starting out, but insulting compared to a lifetime of friendship and promises. Rosa had never cashed it. She'd kept it all these years, along with the letters, an archive of how easily people forget where they came from when climbing towards something better. Margaret felt sick. Jonathan hadn't just refused to help a pregnant woman last night. He'd done it before, 47 years ago, to her mother. He'd abandoned his best friend's widow, an unborn child, because they were inconvenient, because they didn't fit his new trajectory. And now he was holding a press conference to announce his philanthropy, probably wearing the same self-satisfied expression he'd had when he kicked her off his plane. Sarah was crying softly. Mom never said anything. She never told us about him, because she wasn't bitter, Margaret said, her voice thick. Because she chose to remember Dad's friend, not the man who forgot them. That was who she was. She saw the best in people, even when they showed her their worst. Margaret looked at the photograph again, at the two young men who'd had their whole lives ahead of them. One had died too young. The other had built an empire, but lost his humanity somewhere along the way. She checked her phone. 9:45. The press conference was in 15 minutes at the hospital. The same hospital where her mother had just died, where Jonathan would stand in front of cameras and talk about caring for children, while having tried to prevent her from seeing her own mother one last time. I have to go, Margaret said, standing up with difficulty, her pregnant belly making quick movements awkward. Maggie, what are you going to do? I don't know yet. But I'm not letting him use my mother's hospital, the place where she just died, as a backdrop for his redemption story while pretending to be someone he's not. Margaret grabbed her purse in the shoebox. Are you coming? Sarah nodded, grabbing her coat. If you've been moved by this story, please subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales of courage and truth. They drove to Boston General in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about Rosa, the woman who'd raised them with so little but given them everything that mattered. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, they saw the news vans, the reporters, the banner reading, Hartwell Children's Wing, a gift of hope. Margaret took a deep breath, resting her hand on her belly where her daughter kicked insistently. Okay, baby girl. Let's go teach a rich man what real generosity looks like. She walked toward the crowd of reporters with her sister beside her, carrying her mother's box of memories, ready to tell the truth about the man who'd forgotten that wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the promises you keep. The hospital conference room was packed with reporters, cameras and local dignitaries. Jonathan Hartwell stood at a podium, looking polished and philanthropic in his tailored navy suit. A large check made out for $10 million was displayed on an easel beside him. He was mid-speech, his voice smooth and practiced. Because I believe that our community's children deserve the very best care. Having had the privilege of success, I feel it's my responsibility to give back, to ensure that no child suffers due to lack of resources. My mother always taught me that we're measured not by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute. Margaret and Sarah slipped into the back of the room. Several reporters turned, noticing the pregnant woman in yesterday's clothes who looked like she hadn't slept. Margaret caught Jonathan's eye for just a moment. She saw the flicker of recognition, the brief confusion, then the slight tightening around his mouth as he continued his speech without missing a beat. Which is why I'm honored to donate this gift in memory of all the hard-working people who built Boston. The unsung heroes who, like Michael Hayes. Margaret's voice cut through the room, not loud but clear enough to carry. The room fell silent. Cameras swiveled toward her. Jonathan's composure cracked for just a second. I'm sorry, this is a private event. Michael Hayes was my father, Margaret continued, moving slowly through the crowd, which parted for the obviously pregnant woman. He died in a construction accident in 1977, 3 months before I was born. He was your best friend. You called him your brother. The reporters were suddenly very interested, sensing a story. Jonathan's PR manager moved toward Margaret, but a journalist blocked her path, recording everything. Margaret reached the front, pulled out the old photograph and held it up. "This is you and my father. Look how happy you both were. Look how young and full of dreams." She turned to the reporters. "After my father died, Jonathan promised to help my mother, Rosa Hayes. He wrote letters saying he'd be there for us. Then he inherited money and went to college, and suddenly we weren't convenient anymore. He sent one check for $500 and disappeared from our lives." Jonathan's face had gone pale, then flushed red. "This is hardly the time or place." "My mother died this morning," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Right here in this hospital. She died at 6:32 a.m., holding my hand and my sister's. I almost wasn't there. I almost missed the last moments with the woman who sacrificed everything for me, who worked herself to exhaustion cleaning other people's houses because my father's best friend decided we weren't worth remembering." She turned fully to Jonathan now, and the cameras captured every word. "Last night, you kicked me off your private plane when I was trying to reach my dying mother. You didn't know who I was, but it wouldn't have mattered to you either way. You saw a pregnant woman, someone vulnerable and desperate, and you chose convenience over compassion, just like you did 47 years ago." The room was absolutely silent, except for the clicking of cameras. Jonathan's carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time, broadcast live across Boston news stations. "My mother," Margaret continued, "never spoke badly about you. She kept your letters and this photo because she chose to remember my father's friend, not the man who forgot his promises. She taught me that bitterness was poison, that forgiveness was freedom, but she also taught me that truth matters and accountability matters, and that real generosity isn't about tax-deductible donations and photo opportunities. It's about showing up when it's hard, when it's inconvenient, when there's nothing in it for you." Margaret set the shoebox on the podium, next to the oversized check. "So, here's what I'm asking, Mr. Hartwell. Don't name this wing after yourself. Name it after Rosa Hayes. Name it after all the cleaning women and construction workers and single mothers who gave everything for their children without ever expecting recognition. Honor the people who actually embody the values you claim to represent." She locked eyes with him, and for the first time, Jonathan Hartwell looked truly uncomfortable, stripped of his practiced charm. "And maybe, before you donate millions to help children you'll never meet, ask yourself why you couldn't help the ones you knew, why my mother had to raise me alone, why you valued money and status over friendship and loyalty, why you're still, after all these years, choosing optics over genuine human connection." Margaret turned to leave, exhausted and emotionally spent, but Jonathan's voice stopped her. "Wait." He stepped away from the podium, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked human, uncertain, even ashamed. You're right. Everything you said is right. I did abandon your mother. I told myself I'd sent money, that I was young, that I was building a future. But the truth is I was a coward. I was terrified of being poor again, and your mother was a reminder of where I came from. So I left her behind, just like I left every other inconvenient truth about myself behind. He looked at the cameras, then back at Margaret. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but the wing will be named for Rosa Hayes, and I'd like to establish a fund in your father's name, Michael Hayes, for families dealing with medical emergencies. No strings attached, no PR, just helping people the way I should have helped your mother 47 years ago. It wasn't redemption. Margaret knew real change took more than one moment of public honesty. But it was a start. It was acknowledgement. It was, finally, Jonathan Hartwell seeing her mother as a person who mattered, not as an obstacle or memory to be erased. Margaret nodded once, then walked out with Sarah beside her, leaving Jonathan to face the reporters and, perhaps for the first time in decades, himself. 3 months later, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Rosa after her grandmother, the woman who'd taught her that true wealth had nothing to do with money and everything to do with love, sacrifice, and the quiet courage of showing up for people even when the world says they don't matter. And sometimes, late at night while nursing little Rosa, Margaret thought about that November evening, about being kicked off a plane, about finding her mother's box of memories. She thought about how cruelty and kindness both ripple outward in ways we can't always predict, how the choices we make echo through time, how we're all given chances to be better than we were yesterday. She never heard from Jonathan Hartwell again, but she read that the Rosa Hayes Children's Wing had opened to great success, that the Michael Hayes Fund had helped hundreds of families. It didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged it. And sometimes that's where healing begins, in the simple act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and admitting that they deserved better all along. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of courage, redemption, and the power of human connection. Thank you for joining us on Margaret's journey. May we all remember to show up for each other when it matters most.